Hey folks, my name is Tony Mo, and I'm a newer GM. I've been running, I guess we could say, I've got about a year's worth of weekly GM sessions under my belt over the last 3+ years. I started dabbling with 3.5e, but it wasn't until several years later that I really got into GMing as a D&D GM with 5e and homebrewed my own setting, my own campaign, and we ran that for a while up until COVID hit. My mom's in that campaign, and then kind of nothing happened in the tabletop space until late last year, and I started jumping into Cyberpunk Red, and now I've been running a Cyberpunk Red game for going on 4 months. I think we're actually tail end of 4 months, going into 4+ months. And I like to create conversation, discussion, and just general around the things I learn as a GM and the experiences I have. But today, we're not doing a campaign diary. We're not doing a GM guide. We're going to do a review for Cyberpunk Red. This has been a long time coming. I'd like to shout out the folks over at Talstorian because they actually hooked me up with a early PDF, a pre-release review copy of the Cyberpunk Red core book late last year before this went into its full release. So I was able to kind of start checking it out early. This has very much been a review and work for in the works for a long time now, but I really wanted to, actually run the system. That's the thing about doing reviews for anything tabletop RPG related is you got to spend time with the system. And really, I wanted to have that, organic GM experience with it. And I have. And I got to say, I've very much fallen in love with it. I think even detached from the cyberpunk setting, Red mechanically is a very satisfying game to run. And I think to play in, at least my players seem to really enjoy it. And it lets you do a lot of cool shit. I'm only going to say this once because I know how people get about this, but I like the things Red does because it reminds me of some of the things 5e does, okay? The thing I like about 5e is somebody who likes to homebrew a lot of content, who doesn't need to have like every single rule raw, rules as written. I like to be able to just adapt things and modify them to my personal experience as a GM and to the settings and the narrative and combat encounters I'm creating because I don't use modules. I homebrew everything. I'm just that kind of person. Red has let me go absolutely buck wild with that sort of thing. I've got like over a dozen homebrewed weapons and pieces of cyber already. There's just a lot of great things in this system that I think, people will refer to as streamlining, but that I think make it easy to adapt and to modify in all sorts of different directions. And I really appreciate that as a GM. And I think it also makes this a really great entry point for people who are new to tabletop RPGs who are like, they want the cyberpunk fix. Maybe they played 2077, they were excited for it. And like, man, tabletop cyberpunk, let's do that. Let's run that. Let's play that for the first time together. But we'll talk more about, sort of the new player experience a little bit later on. I guess to start, number one, I'm going to make it clear, we're going to review more than just the Red core book. We're also going to talk about the other things I've used in my time running my campaign. We're going to talk about the data screen that was recently released. There's also like a bunch of free DLC that Talstorian has put out that has been fantastic for, just further integrating into your campaigns and experiences. But let's go ahead and start with the actual kind of the book itself, the layout of the book, and just, how things are kind of laid out, because I do have some things to say about this. It is, number one, a very rich book in that there's a lot in here. You have to remember this is a GM's guide, a player handbook, and it's also got a bunch of narrative stuff that lays out the setting for the 2045 setting that it takes place, Cyberpunk Red, the time of Red, right? So there's a lot in here. Like, you're good to go with this. The PDF is only $30, by the way, which is a great entry point to hop into it. I really would recommend that over the Jumpstart kit. For anyone who maybe is going to ask that question, just go with the full PDF. Or a physical copy if you prefer. Skip the Jumpstart kit. Jumpstart kit was great when Red wasn't out and they were using it to kind of test the waters. I don't really see a reason to purchase it right now. Get yourself the full book and you'll be good to go forever. So there's a lot in here. I can understand why the layout is a bit jank at times. It is something that you do have to sort of overcome when you first start learning the system, especially if you got a bunch of people all learning the system together at once, because some things are just kind of spotty in terms of their positioning in the book. There's a few things that are like in 3 different places. There's occasionally going to be important bits of information that are only in a sidebar. That happens with like the vehicle repair mechanic, and I think even like repairing armor. The way that's mentioned is also like in a sidebar. So there's bits and bobs of awkwardness It is really not the end of the world type stuff, but it is just, there's going to be small moments of frustration caused by it. Once you spend enough time with the book and you start taking notes and you start to, get a feel for where things are, or just memorize how certain mechanics work, that will obviously go away. And I think overall the book is actually laid out pretty well. It's just those few sticking points that stand out, like you're flipping through the book and somebody stabs you with a needle occasionally, because they're just so noticeable, especially once you start really expanding beyond the initial chunks of the system and getting into some of the other things you can do with it, like vehicle combat, for example. Some of the rules again for that are just kind of a little bit all over the place. I know that people also had a lot of questions that actually were just recently answered in not just in the errata that the team at Talsorian has been updating, sort of corrections for the book, but also an FAQ they just recently did that they actually posted as a module. That's been really great. If you've been running and you're not aware of that, you should totally check it out. A lot of great rules as written type stuff, like details and explainers, and even little charts for hey, this is what you can and can't do, to just kind of further refine the rule set and help people better understand it. I was not so much frustrated by that because I don't mind having things unanswered. I know some of my players like that, but they don't explain exactly how it works. I'm like, yeah, but we'll just house rule. Who cares? Whatever, move on. I don't mind that stuff as a GM, so it has not been like a detriment to my experience. And the team has again already gone above and beyond to make sure that stuff has been answered for the players. Honestly, before the FAQ was even released, if there's one thing you need to know about Talsorian, if you're looking to, that was a very nice car that drove by. If you're looking to get into Red, is that they are everywhere. Okay, Jay Gray. This individual responds to all the questions. If you're on the subreddit, if you're in multiple Cyberpunk Red discords, there's one for the VTT and stuff that I'm in. Specifically the Cyberpunk Red 2020 fans, Talsorian members are in there answering questions and giving feedback and their personal thoughts on mechanics people might be asking about, and I fucking love that. The team at Talsorian is absolutely stellar, and I know that getting Red out was no easy feat for them. In the middle of the fucking pandemic, they still got this thing out at the end of last year, so huge kudos to them. All things said, let's go ahead and actually jump into Red as a tabletop RPG system. I think I want to start by talking about sort of the narrative structure, the setting itself, to kind of give you an idea of what you can expect if you're, a GM, newer or, veteran, doesn't really matter, player, new or veteran, who's looking to just pick up this book and start playing right away. You don't need to run out and pick up a bunch of additional modules. There's already some stuff in the book, so you can kind of get some basic encounters going. There are currently, I know, at least not in the States anyway, there aren't any really long, extensive adventure modules, already out there. There's obviously old Cyberpunk stuff you could pretty easily adapt, in my opinion. There's some shorter stuff in here, more small scream sheet kind of focused encounter stuff. There is actually a huge story in here. Called Black Dog that I think you could very much run through and modify into a setting if you were so inclined or had the skill set to do something like that. It's pretty cool. It has some great characters. I could easily see this getting adapted into something that your PCs got to take part in alongside of these PCs. But again, it's more short stuff. That said, I think Red is set up beautifully, the setting for it in 2045, to play a very cooperative campaign. Which to some people, this is going to be that's what I always do. That's fantastic. I love that sort of GM player collaboration. For some of you, that might not be how you run things, and your players expect you to kind of handle everything. I can come up with stuff all day long, but I like when my players can have a say in things. So if you open up Red and go into the narrative sections, you can all sit down together and kind of get a feel for the world building that Talsorian has set up. That everybody who's worked on writing out this setting has worked on. And then you can kind of plug yourselves into it anywhere. And there's a map that has all of these locations that already exist. So you can just open up that map. You don't even need to make your own map. There's Night City map with all these environments. And you can just say to your players, okay, hey, where do you guys want to be? What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? And then work together to build that initial party. And then let them go loose and say, hey, we want to go do this, or we want to do these kind of jobs, right? There's so much stuff already there for you to pull from if you are inclined to play that sort of game, to run that sort of game. It will be super easy to just get into it and to start messing around. And I love that. I mean, that's what you want, right? You want to pick up one book and you want to be able to just go. And I think the great thing about the red system mechanically, like from a gameplay perspective, is that running just like really simple encounters, the players like show up, get in a firefight with a bunch of bad guys at like a bar or something in the city. It's fun. Throw a few like narrative skill checks in there as your team gets into the fray and as they exit the combat, and then enjoy the combat, and you can just have an absolute blast with this system. Right from the get-go, it is ready to run, which is like an RC saying, but I think it applies here as well. So while we're on that subject, let's talk a little bit about skills, player characters, combat. These are obviously very important parts of the experience. Basically, let's talk narrative encounters, the world, the downtime, and combat. Because these are what make up, basically the main components of any session of a tabletop RPG, and especially of Cyberpunk Red. So I think the most important thing to understand here is while we do have a role-based system where players, choose like Rocker Boy, Tech, Solo, and then they get trees that they can progress through with their improvement points as well as individual skills, there's a ton of flexibility for players to just totally go wild with those player characters. The folks over at Telsorian themselves have even already came up with like alternate versions of those characters. Oh, you could be, you want to be a rockstar, you could be a professional dancer, you could be a private detective. There is such a wonderful level of variety and diversity to the actual skills themselves that you can pretty much like subclass spec your role any way you want once you get things going. I'm trying to get to the skill page so I can demonstrate that, or at least just kind of scan through these. And I really appreciate that. I think a lot of tabletop RPGs try to have like, I shouldn't say that, not all do, but a lot of the games you'll run into do try to give players like a huge list of skills to choose from to really kind of spec out their characters. And I would say that Red is, no different. You can get into here. It's pretty easy to understand what a skill does. There's also like a really great sort of base system, I guess is what I'll call it. Basically, when you look at a skill, it explains to you in a narrative context and in game context what your character is capable of at a base of 10 and at a base of 14 and then at a base of 18, like sort of being the highest, right? Which is a great way to quickly look at these skills and to understand like what your player characters are capable of, which I think is really useful for the GM side of things, because you're definitely going to be looking through the skills page and being like, what skill checks, might I be asking of my players? What skill checks might they throw at me? And where are they considering their, like how much they've spec'd into those individual skills? Because this is not a like level up style system, right? In Cyberpunk, you don't go from like level 1 to 50 and then your HP gets more, right? You are kind of always the same person. The body you start out with, unless you modify it with cyber or exo suits and stuff like that, is what it is. You instead improve your skills, which doesn't necessarily just make your skills like do more damage if they're damage focused. It's more about making them more efficient, right? So whether that's a damage focused skill or like an athletics focused skill, or maybe you're a solo who has a strong background in private investigation, and so you have criminology skills. You are doing stuff like deduction and actual tracking, even maybe, right? You spec into those skills and just get more proficient at them, making it easier for you to roll high rolls against demanding skill check DVs that will allow you to just honestly feel fucking cooler. And this is obviously something you as a GM are going to want to integrate into your game. And I just think Red sets up really well for all of this. It's a great way to pull players into their roles. So if you've got newer players who are maybe struggling to feel like or to play as if they're really in the shoes of the PC they might have spent all this time making a background for, starting to throw skill checks at them, starting to create encounters or put them in situations that will sort of force these skill checks to come about, is a great way to make them feel in character. For example, I've got a nomad in my group who is newish player, has a little bit of experience with tabletop games, but doesn't really know how to like really role play their character. And I know that their tracking's good. They had an entire narrative encounter leading to a combat encounter that I actually talked about in another video. If you want to check that out, it'll be linked down in the description below, where we used a tracking skill check. And this individual, as they're driving this car through this canyon to go rescue another PC, got to make tracking skill checks against a competing tracker. And I've been able to expose them to a lot more of those opportunities We do racing stuff with this character all the time, especially as we maybe like have large chunks of time that pass. I'll be like, hey, the summer league for the Nomad Rally League was around, and you raced in it. Let's get some of them land drive vehicle checks going. And the same goes for a lot of my other PCs. We had a Rocker Boys done performance checks. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff here that can really let your players feel like they're player characters, flex those skill check muscles, and as a GM, give you huge opportunities to break out the dice, which are important. The dice, that's where the gravity, the weight of consequence comes into play, and where you can really make a player feel like, hey, shit, I got to beat this DV of 24. If I can beat this DV of 24, maybe good things are going to happen. I'm not sure, but that's what I got to be, right? Break out the dice and you roll against it. So I really appreciate the way skills are handled in the game. I think they're implemented really well. I think it makes it very easy as a GM to look at them and to use different skill checks for narrative encounters. And again, there's just a huge variety of skills. It's nice. If you're looking to make, new character after new character in the years to come in this game, you can definitely do all sorts of fun stuff. And that's before you even start, messing with like homebrewing and really tweaking the skills that are here to come up with whatever your wildest dreams can imagine. So let's talk, speaking of skill checks, let's move into combat, where you're going to be doing some skill checks and talk about how, sort of the core combat is handled in Red. I think anybody who's played 2020, thinks of Cyberpunk as a very lethal game, right? Very easy to die. You die quickly, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, it's really all about how your GM runs the game, right? But there are definitely mechanics baked into Red, into Cyberpunk, that make it lethal. Obviously, the death save being like you having to roll under your body is a pretty big one. In fact, one of the PCs recently has a new character now. This player character has like a body of 3. And they almost went down in their very first combat with this new player character. And it was like, yeah, they would have had to roll under a 3. That's not easy. And guess what? You can't use luck in your death saves. No. You could house rule that if you wanted to. But yeah, that's not easy, okay? You got like kind of one chance there. Unless somebody can come over and pick your butt up. It's not a long-term like death save system like you might get in D&D. So yes, there's definitely an element of lethality to this game. But I think it is very much how the GM runs it. That all being said, let's get, sort of the setup out of the way here. You run the game that you want to run and that your players also want to run, right? So if your players want a game where they have more of a power fantasy, and they just stomp on everything, and they're super over geared, and they have tons of great weaponry, and they're just dealing with trash all over the place, you can totally run that. I will say this because I know I'm speaking to probably the majority of you are new players, people who maybe even haven't played Cyberpunk yet, 2020, Red, let alone 2020. I will say this, okay? There are going to be a lot of tools that your players are going to be unfamiliar with as they make these new characters and as you start running this campaign. The same is going to go for you as a GM. So you're going to be kind of on this journey together where you're all growing, starting to better understand the game's mechanics and systems. But even then, you will reach a point as a GM where you'll probably start realizing all these combat encounters are way too easy for my players. They're stomping everything. You'll start to crank things up. Your players, on the other hand, they're going to just kind of be in like gunning everything down, right? And they're going to probably end up in a situation where they're just not using all of the tools in their toolbox because there's no need for it. Okay? If you give me a video game where I can just run in and shoot things in the chest and they die just as quickly as if I took the time to shoot them in the head, I'm just going to shoot them in the chest, right? But if you suddenly give me, an additional mechanic here, if you shoot this guy in the head, if you shoot this guy in the back, you'll do 3 times as much damage. I'm going to start utilizing that, right? When you run a less challenging combat encounter in Red, your players are going to use the bare minimum in terms of their tools from their toolbox to complete that encounter because that's all they need. So the best thing that you can do if you're playing with a group that is totally okay with like stress and tension that a combat encounter can really start to deliver is to push them to the edge, okay? When I started running my campaign, we're kind of getting a feel for things, seeing how things happen, getting our heads wrapped around the combat. 3 months on, my players now have a very different understanding of what to expect from combat, all right? The current combat we're in it's split across 2 sessions because it's so meaty and so lethal, and they are doing their best to like stay alive and to just and to make this happen, right? I like pushing them to the edge. I like creating tension mechanics that happen on a round-and-round basis in my combats. I want them to be forced to dig into their toolbox and to grab the tools that they don't even normally consider using. I want them to look at their skills and to try to bullshit me as the GM and say, hey, if I do this with this skill, could I do this? Will you let me get away with that? I want them to do stuff like that. Number one, I think it's fun to be able to, to be forced to think outside of the box. But it makes me smile. It makes me smile when they get creative. It makes me smile when they wrap up a combat where they just barely survive, and one of them goes to the local gun store, and literally just buys all the hand grenades. Like, hey, how many grenades do you have right now for sale? 12? I'll buy them all. Suddenly it's like, hey, what other tools can I maybe even add to my toolbox to make sure that I've got more options when the shit hits the fan? And I think that's just where the combat in Red starts to function best. Again, especially if you have new players who need to be sort of persuaded, we'll say, nicely persuaded to consider the things they could be doing in combat that they haven't been doing, because things are finally getting hard and they're at their wits' end, right? They're scraping the bottom of the barrel to try and come out on top. I think that's where this game's combat starts to shine, where it excels, and where it's going to be easier for your players to more organically discover the directions they want to push their characters in when it comes to spending those improvement points. So improvement points are rewarded at the end of a session by the GM. You have like group improvement points, and then you can reward individual improvement points, and they use those to go level up their skills. So somebody might put a bunch of points into auto fire, so their auto fire is more effective, and so on and so forth, right? If combat's just kind of going very easy, there's a good chance your players aren't going to feel like the need to improve any of those things. Unless it's really a stat like auto fire that kind of sucks at the start and you do need to dump points into, your players might kind of feel lost, like they don't really know what direction to take their characters. So challenging them in combat, just as much as you challenge them with skill checks in the narrative side of things, I think is really important to helping them figure out how they want to develop their characters and developing their own play styles. If you're more familiar with video games here, think about an RPG where, you're put to the test and you walk into a room. There's a locked door. There's a locked terminal. There's a wall you could punch through. You as a player are going to start to think to yourself, okay, if I improve my lockpicking, I could just lockpick that door. If I improve my hacking, I could maybe hack the security system. Or if I just get super strong in like cyber arms, I could just punch through the wall, right? So giving your player those sort of avenues, presenting them with those challenges that then will open up doorways they can choose to go down is very important, I think, for helping them with their character development. Again, and you got to do that in combat as much as you do it in narrative encounters. So that's why I've enjoyed really pushing them to the edge. With that said, that, kind of points to the improvement point system. And I think also one of the most important things you need to understand as a GM, one thing that I think Red actually does make clear, but that it's just one of those things that requires experience. And that is really understanding how to scale difficulty for your encounters for your players. The book is going to give you like a basic set of mooks, right, of bad guys that rank from like basic to lieutenant to mini boss to boss, and the game will tell you, hey, this many of this difficulty can go up against this many edge runners. And what the game is telling you is that if you do whatever they're recommending, the chances of your edge runners, of your PCs coming out on top is very high. I think that's the important thing to notice, at least from my experience, is that that's the baseline they're setting, okay? You can probably double whatever their recommendation is, and the players will be able to find a way out on top. And in some cases, you might need to do that to really establish the risks for your players, to help them understand just what is at odds and to get them thinking tactically when they're actually playing in combat. The reason I'm mentioning all of this and the reason I'm kind of pushing this direction with how I'm saying you should look at this book and how I think combat should be handled, from like a review and experience perspective at this point, is that I just think as a whole, the combat is more fun that way. I mean, plain and simple. I think combat in a lot of tabletop RPGs can be very going through the motions. And some people don't care. Some people are more interested in the narrative stuff, and that's totally fine. Combat's only there when it needs to be there. But if you're running a game that is 50-50 like I am. I think both can be great. I think they can influence each other. I think they should influence each other. I think they can both push the narrative forward. Then you want to make sure that they both present experiences that are fun and that provoke the players and that make them think, right? And so you just gotta crank things up a little bit. Red is all about its armor system at the end of the day. So once you wrap your head around that and you understand, like, giving a unit better armor or increasing the armor value is really how you can significantly modify the difficulty of an encounter with relative ease. Then things will get easier for you. And I guess that's just to actually talk from like a review perspective here. It's not difficult to do that in Red. It just takes time. It just takes experience like anything. And I think what started off as one of the more challenging aspects of running Red was just like figuring out how to make my NPCs work the way I want to make them work to give a certain level of challenge to the players. Very quickly became something that was really easy to do. Like, I can crank out an NPC in no time now. It's very easy to start to look at the skills. I think especially the more you communicate with your players and you see how they run their PCs, it's kind of the same, with your NPCs. You're just going to build out the stats that are most important for that NPC. So when I did the tracking, the opposed tracking rolls with my Nomad, I made a character who had the same tracking skill he did because I wanted them to be rolling against each other with very close rolls. I wanted it to be a very difficult, seemingly tracker versus tracker. These two individuals are great at what they do. Boom, headbutting. And so it was as simple as that. You'll very quickly see like, oh, shoulder arms. That really influences the ability for somebody to hit with their assault rifle. So if I want these guys to be deadly accurate, I want to get that stat maybe just above where the players are at. That's honestly the best thing about this system is it's so easy to just look at where your players are and then basically make the NPCs the same. Honestly, in my experience, if you match them, if you want to, if you got a bunch of players running handguns and shoulder arms and you want them to have kind of like a fair firefight in terms of the damage and the chances to hit anyway, you can just, my players at level 5, well, all these NPCs are shoulder arms level 5. Maybe you put one person in there who's like the boss, the leader, and he hits way harder. You crank him up to 8. His chance to hit is much higher, and the players, they acknowledge it because they will learn fast. This guy doesn't miss. And so, yeah, you just can kind of do these comparisons, and you can start to make NPCs almost based off of your PC skill sheets and tweak them and modify them, and it becomes very, very easy to do, to the point where I understand why they don't have 40 pages in the back of the book just filled with NPCs. I think it's totally unnecessary for the way this game functions and works. Just boost up the skills you want that character to use. Consider what they might be using those skills against so you create something that feels fair. And don't be afraid to really pour the numbers on the players. To throw 8 units with crappy 7 SP armor at them. They will rip through that in no time. But man, there'll be a lot of units on the battlefield and they'll be concerned. Trust me. So I love the combat in this game. Things can snowball pretty quickly in terms of how armor ablation works. But overall, I think the whole system actually works really smoothly. It has a nice flow to it once you get comfortable with it. And where our combat encounters, like just individual turns of combat encounters used to take forever when we started playing, they have very quickly, things have just become much smoother. It's just something that takes a little bit of time. I think the system itself is great the way it is. Do we talk about narrative stuff? I guess not really, kind of, right? With the skills and stuff. To kind of roll back on that, I like how easy it is to flow in and out of narrative encounters and combat encounters. Like I said, I run kind of a 50-50 game. I think they're both important. I think they both should be handled with the same level of care. And I want them to both of them to present interesting opportunities for my players to make skill checks, to test the mettle of their characters, if you will. And it's now that I've figured out where that sort of stopgap is for me for a transition point from a narrative into a combat, it's super easy to do. And I get to have those great moments where I'm like, all right, I'm going to need you all to roll for initiative. And everybody's like, wait, oh shit, okay. Here we go. And I love that. I want it to I want them to feel like there's always a threat, right? I don't want it to necessarily feel like they know exactly when combat's going to happen, because we never have any sort of combat style roles in the narrative. I do combat type roles in the narrative all the time with their basic skill checks, and I love that. I love the shoulder arms check and like the fact that there are these individual weapon style checks. It means that I can have them in a high speed car chase shooting at another car, and we're just doing it with skill checks. We don't even need to bust out a grid and be like, all right, go ahead and roll the hit. And I think that actually allows for really great moments where you can kind of build out those power fantasies for your players, right? Because if they start to put points into those skill checks, like let's say somebody just puts a ton of points in auto fire, and they're in the backseat of a car getting chased, and he's like, all right, well, I want to pull out my rifle and shoot at this guy. And I'm like, okay, well, we're not in combat, it's still narrative, so just go ahead and give me an auto fire check. And I set a DV. They roll really high on it. They hit. I'm like, okay, man, you just dump all of your ammo like into this guy, easy. The DV was 17. What'd you roll? And they're like, oh, I rolled like a 20. I'm like, okay, well then go ahead and roll for damage, and then I can have them actually just roll that damage against the SDP of the car. I could just tell them that they straight out kill someone. I could give a fictional pool of HP to an NPC, and we can ignore the entire armor system for the sake of this narrative style combat encounter. It's so easy to adapt and to mess with these things. I've had a ton of fun running those sorts of encounters with the players, and I just, it's just a great opportunity to create cool moments where it's like, man, you just preemed on this roll. You shot through the back window of your own car just above your buddy's head and took out the tire in this car, and this thing just goes flat and just flips in the air. They go rolling all over the place. We're gonna go back and finish them. It's great. I have really, really enjoyed this system. I appreciate just the amount of flexibility there is as a GM to just plug in the mechanics where I see fit and pretty much build out like entire moments of risk and reward for the players, something for them to roll against, if you will, something to challenge them in a matter of seconds, minutes, whatever I feel is needed. While we're still kind of in the general area of combat, Red switches to a pure D6 system for combat. Okay, if you aren't familiar with 2020, it does use like D10s in some cases. Red just goes pure D6. With nothing really using D10s. And so that also means for the most part that they keep everything in categories. So all assault rifles are 5d6, pistols are like whatever 3d6, depending on if they're heavy and stuff like that. Everything kind of stays the same, right? So what you might initially feel, and what I felt like when I first started running this, was like, oh, it's not really a huge, amount of variety. You kind of got like your base weapons and yada yada. And that may be the case. I mean, there's still shotguns with slugs and shells, which function completely differently. There's still rocket launchers, grenade launchers, several different melee weapons, several different SMG types, pistol types, rifle. There's a lot there, actually, right? But I get the idea of like wanting more. And so when you look through the list of all the guns and stuff in here, you're going to be like, oh, there's just this and there's just that. Because it's all this 5d6 system, you might feel like not much is changing, even if you start to look into the attachments pool. But this is where you can start to have some fun with homebrew and also adapting weapons from like Black Hand's Street Weapons or the 2020 books, which is actually very, very easy to do. I would say it's so easy to come up with fun, interesting homebrew weapons in this game that anyone can do it, anyone should do it, and you shouldn't even really worry too much about whether or not you make something broken, because as long as you don't fuck with the damage roll too much, in my opinion, just leave it alone always. You can give the player cool like firing modes and attachments that do weird things, and you'll be able to know exactly what they do because there's no real dice roll involved with those things the majority of the time. And if you apply them to something that already exists in the game, like, for example, a skill check for resist drugs and torture roll, then you know exactly what the outcome is going to be. So let me give you a great example of one of the many things I've homebrewed. I've homebrewed a ton of stuff for the players at this point. There is a ton of nanotechnology in my campaign. One of the players has a weird and like basically a symbiotic relationship with these nanites that exist in his body now. Yeah, we've gotten crazy and it just kind of all works, which I love. So it just works. Very Todd Howard moment here. When one of my PCs decided that his player character Bandsaw, who's a rocker boy, was going to go off, they had this big job climax. If it happens, he's like, hey, I want him to kind of move on and go tour the Midwest, and I want to play another character. So we introduced and implemented this character as an NPC without the other players knowing into the campaign. They even work alongside of this character. And then the time comes, he jumps into this character, and I'm like, well, we're pretty far into our campaign now. We're in the 4-month mark. Everybody else has kind of got like cool signature weapons that I've made for them that they've been awarded, or that they've gained access to from jobs you guys have been on, cool missions you've been on. Your character should have something like that as they start off here, because they've lived a life already in Night City, working for Danger Girl as a detective. And so I came up with this signature Kalashnikov for this player. So it's called Lynx's Kalashnikov PDP, prototype, personal defense prototype. It's a prototype PDW from a Kalashnikov that comes equipped with a Dazzle Tac-Light system and a fluorothermal hollow sight. The way this gun works, number one, it's got an auto fire up to 4, 30 rounds, 5d6. Again, it's an AR, 5d6 damage. We keep that the same, okay? It can be suppressed, and it gives them a narrative stealth bonus if they decide to use their gun, like a narrative attack roll with this thing. But the main idea here is the actual function of the scope and of that flashlight. So the player can burn their movement action in a combat sequence, the entire movement action, to use either one of these mechanics. So if they use the Dazzle Tac-Light, they're going to attempt to focus the Tac-Light beam on their target, forcing them to make a DV-17 resist torture / drugs roll. If the target fails that, they take the damage die condition for 1 turn, and the user is granted a +4 modifier to auto fire on the target. So this was purpose-built for this character. I asked my buddy Trevor, hey, what kind of like combat style are you looking at for Lynx? And he's like, I want to be able to kind of like get in, deal out damage, and kind of get out. He's very low body, very cyber-focused character, doesn't have a ton of HP, could literally be one-shotted by a sniper through his subdermal armor. He's like, I want to be able to get in, kind of like, and then like get out. And I was like, okay. He's like, but I also kind of want to be able to like, be like a good shooter. Like, I want to have those moments of precision. And I was like, well, why don't I let him have both, right? Like, he can make a decision. He can't always apply both at the same time, but he can make a choice. And so close quarters, he's got that +4 modifier to auto fire. Basically, it just decreases the difficulty of auto fire. It's normally an 8, so that makes his auto fire penalty like a negative -4 or whatever. The Fleur Hollow Sight is all about aim shots then. So if he goes ahead and burns a movement action, he can make an aim shot with a -6 penalty rather than a -8 penalty. On top of that, this thing has a passive allowing it to basically negate any vision penalties, such as smoke screen, because it's the thermal sight. And so, yeah, it's really easy to make stuff like that. Once you get familiar with the game's mechanics and systems, you can ask yourself, hey, what's something the player would like to be able to do that maybe they don't have to, have an entirely separate thing for? I'm going to plug this into their gun, and as long as that damage stays the same, you're just kind of modifying the chance for them to do something, the chance for them to hit, the ability of them to hit in a situation that might otherwise give them penalties, but the damage just stays the same. You keep it at 5d6, and it's a great way to homebrew stuff without messing around with things. I see a lot of people homebrewing stuff, and they get wild. They're like, there's 96 damage, and I'm like, I don't know about that, pal. You know how much 96 damage is? You have to remember the way ablation works in this game, is that if you let somebody do a ton of damage at once, they're going to ablate, and then that leftover damage, if whatever goes over the armor is going to just all hit the armor. So I like to leave my damage where it is, and I think that's a great thing about this system being streamlined into a D6 system, is it's easy to homebrew. I love it. Some other things that I wanted to talk about, the data screen that came out, which is only $8. You can get a physical version of it. The PDF is $8. Great. It's just a solid data screen. Kind of what you would expect. It's got all the stuff you need on here. I think they did a good job in making sure too that some of the things that maybe aren't as, let's just say, well presented in the book, they might be like kind of tucked away a little bit, are front and center here, like complementary skill checks, taking extra time, which is not something that I think a lot of people even realize they can do, or your player characters might not, or your GMs might be not even aware that the player characters can do this. There's charts on here for modifier examples, for making things harder. Basic prices for the price chart, job payouts. You've got obviously the stuff you need for range combat with all the DVs in the chart there, which is great. It's a solid DM sheet, and it has a dark mode. So when you buy the PDF, you get a light mode and dark mode. Whoever did that, it's a great idea. Great idea. Whoever's idea it was, just yes. Fuck yes. Fantastic. Talsorian also recently came out with a Night City weather system. So this lets you roll for weather, but it's also got like a couple new pieces of equipment in here. I actually really like some of the weather mechanics in this game. I've used Ash the Ash Storm specifically for a job that the players did where they went out to a gorilla farm on the edge of out in the Badlands. And they were kind of racing to get there and to get these goods back as the farm was shutting down and relocating so people wouldn't find it. And there's also an ash storm coming in. So the players have these masks to protect them from the ash storm, but I have baddies taking aim shots at them, trying to break the masks. I like the weather stuff that they've implemented a lot. I think the important thing here is you might look at some of this stuff, right, and be like, oh, that's not even a lot. Like one ablation, it adds up. More importantly, the mental effect of the players, like, having their armor bladed by one. If they understand how the game works, if they've been in enough combats, that's going to feel like a lot to them. And I'm all about tension mechanics. I want my players to feel like shit is, this is not great, guys. This could affect us. Honestly, even in situations where I'm like, I know they've got this, they'll be fine. I still want them to feel like maybe they don't, because I think that's a huge part of what makes this particular system so damn fun to run, is really making your players just feel like shit could go south at any given moment. And then them always trying to be prepared for whatever that is. But yeah, that pretty much covers. They've released a ton of free stuff as well. Those are the things I've personally used. One of these days, I will have my players mess around in Elfine's Online, which is an entire fantasy MMO that exists within the world of Cyberpunk Red, which I think is pretty freaking cool. There's also some new stuff on the way from Talsorian. I know they're putting like a compilation together for all of the free DLC they released and then adding new stuff on top of that to make a paid package that I'm looking forward to. And then they're also working on like Black Chrome. They're going to start expanding some of the other systems in the game, doing, I guess, versions of the books that existed for 2020 to expand the world of Red in 2045. Either way, I can't recommend this enough. I think if you're a new player, if you're new to tabletop RPGs, this is a great system to jump into. It's got really fun, satisfying combat. It's pretty easy to pick up and learn. Putting aside some of like the layout issues that I have with the book, I don't think those things are really going to stop you from learning the game, right? You can jump in here, pick a point on the map and tell your players, hey, you guys are going to go here and shoot some stuff. And honestly, that's how you learn to fucking GM, man. You just pop open the book with your friends. You all say you want to do this, and then you just do it, and you mess up. You make a bunch of mistakes. You do things that don't make sense, but you're okay with that, and you say, okay, next time, this is how the rule actually works. Let's try this again, and then you learn, and you get better, and before you know it, a lot of the information is in the back of your head, and you're coming up with your own encounters, and you're just having a blast. I can't recommend checking this out enough. $30 for the PDF is ridiculously good, especially because then you can, share that PDF with your group. You guys could all chip in on a physical copy even to have at your table. The book itself isn't even expensive. I think it goes for like 40 or 50 right now if you're looking for the physical, if you can find it at a place. And it's just everything all in one, man. You don't need to buy 3 books, which is nice. So Cyberpunk Red gets a big thumbs up from me. Even as I'm moving into a Pathfinder 2e campaign that I've wanted to run for a very long time, we're not going to stop running our Red campaign because everybody's enjoying it so much and I'm having a blast running it. So once again, thanks to Talsorian for sending me an early review copy of this late last year. I'm glad I could finally get this review out. I'm glad I've got to spend so much time with this because it's just been so much fun to whip stuff up for and just go absolutely wild. But I think really this system is great for a variety of different, player levels, GM skill levels. Just give it a shot. I don't think you'll regret it. That's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, folks. Take care of yourselves out there. Be awesome to one another. I'll see you around.